As crazy as it may sound, opera has a pretty realistic claim of being the greatest Western art form, and with it, the greatest art form in human history. Well, why do I say that? The modern symphonic orchestra as it developed in the Christian West over the centuries is the supreme musical instrument in its expressive, tonal, and range-wise potential. It combines a variety of instruments unmatched anywhere in known human history, and puts them harmoniously together to serve one expressive compositorial purpose, under the hand of a conductor. Add to that now the theatrical aspect of opera, the visual art, and then, above all, as the capstone, the central leading instrument of the orchestra in the opera, which is the human voice developed to its absolute maximal athletic and acoustic potential. One person out singing as many as over 100 instruments playing at the same time. Every aspect of human ingenuity, from poetry to musical gifting to vocal talent to instrumental virtuosity and again to visual art, is found in opera. And there's no doubt that Christian Western civilization borrowed extensively while developing this art form from previous civilizations, especially pagan Greece. In fact, our major and minor scales and the other modes, yes, there are other modes and scales that exist in traditional Western music, are named after Greek peoples and regions. But the harmonic language that we're familiar with, the tropes, the cliches, and also the creative harmonic progressions, the modulations, the sense of the way that melodies can fit together in what's called counterpoint and create one cohesive whole while maintaining independence. This is a unique Western contribution to the world, and it was developed in large part in the Renaissance and then especially systematized and perfected in the Baroque period in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, with Johann Sebastian Bach coming to the forefront as the face of the modern harmonic language, as it continues to be taught even to this day in universities around the world. Bach's generally four-part chorales for soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, usually written for liturgical function, and, like all of his pieces, signed Soli Deo Gloria, Glory to God alone, continue to be the textbook by inference of what ideal pre-jazz contrapunctual harmony sounds like in Western music. Bach's part writing was the model that composers after him followed, and continues to this day to be the starting point of all harmonic writing in the Western tradition. Bach himself never wrote any operas, but he did write oratorios, which are basically semi-stage concert performances of themes and stories from the Bible for human voices and orchestra. But the honor of fathering opera is generally ascribed to Claudio Monteverdi, an Italian composer who himself wrote a lot of sacred music and also began to set stories from mythology like the story of Orpheus and Eurydice to music. And thus opera as an art form began to emerge increasingly clearly and distinctly from the Italian peninsula. Western composers after that would only expand the art form further, and the instrumental palette that was available to them, the harmonies that their ears sought out, the complexity of the structure of their storytelling, all of these things grew and developed over time. But the foundation from which these developments occurred was a worldview based in Western Christian piety, where many composers intentionally and other composers simply being swept up in the spirit of their age, imitating God's creative act in the beginning of Genesis, where out of chaotic, disordered matter, God puts everything into its proper order and brings stability and purpose. And so composers, seeking to discover some sort of inherent order that existed in the universe, sought to perfect harmonic patterns and melodic patterns and symmetries and other aspects of music that worked almost objectively. And of course, in their exploration, they discovered new things, they developed new tropes, they were not stifled in their creativity, but they were going under the assumption that they were discovering something with objective existence and developing along the grains of nature, along the grains of a world that was designed to have purpose and order and intelligibility. Now, emphatically, secular and religious music always existed side by side in this European environment. There's simply no plausible claim that all music was explicitly religious, but it is pretty incredible how religious themes factor even into the more secular. Oratorio, again, was its own genre distinct from opera, and it was exclusively religious. But opera also took religious themes to heart, and some stories were explicitly Christian in nature. Think, for example, Goethe's Faust, which served as the inspiration for so many operas, including, maybe perhaps preeminently, Gounod's Faust. That's not even mentioning many other operas that are based explicitly on biblical stories. But perhaps even more telling here is the number of operas that have secular plot lines that are nevertheless permeated by Christian piety. We can look at Violetta, for example, in Verdi's La Traviata, where from being a courtesan, she falls in love with a man who seeks to be relatively honorable towards her, and she appeals to God as having washed away her sins, having freed her, having given her a new start. Or perhaps Rigoletto, where the rather boisterous and disrespectful mocking jester in the king's court prizes the chastity of his daughter, a Christian virtue which was also known, of course, in the pagan world before Christianity, and goes as far as to invoke the lightning wrath of God against the duke who seduces his daughter. There's Gaetano Donizetti's opera Poliuto, one of his most personal works, which tells the story of a Roman officer who, rather than to betray the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, chooses to die as a martyr for his faith. And in the opera, his wife goes with him too. And we may also look at Puccini's La Fanciulla del West, the Daughter of the West, where Minnie begins the opera by reading from the Old Testament scriptures to the rough-handed miners, specially focusing on the greatest of the penitential psalms, Psalm 51. And then the rest of the plot proceeds to tell exactly such a redemption story. Dick Johnson, previously a thief, symbolically dies under the rooftop of Minnie's house and is born anew. And when he is taken to be hanged by the miners whom he has defrauded, Minnie interposes her own life, her own goodness, her own great reputation with the miners, and how much they love her, in order to save Dick Johnson's life from the hangman's rope. Having purchased his life from the very gates of death, Minnie and Dick Johnson now leave California to begin a new life of redemption. Even Richard Wagner, who's known more for his interest in Norse mythology, is deeply permeated with Christian themes of redemption, as scholars have long recognized. Mozart's famous nobleman, Don Giovanni, is a Casanova-esque figure, a womanizer, an abuser, but ultimately the point of the opera is that he gets his due. A man even comes back from the grave, almost like Samuel rising to confront Saul, to drag Don Giovanni to his deserved fate into the very flames of hell. The list of names won't end anytime soon, but we can mention also Pietro Mascagni in his very famous Cavalleria Rusticana. The central plotline deals with the consequences of unchastity, both fornication and adultery, which leads to disgrace in the community, alienation from the church in damnable sin, and ultimately a duel to the death that ends up in spilt blood. And if that weren't enough, the story that Mascagni sets is placed on Easter Day, originally known as La Mala Pasqua, an ominous Pascha, an ominous Easter, an Easter filled with misfortune because of human sin. And at the very center of this one-act masterpiece of Italian verissimo opera, Mascagni places an enormous, gorgeous, overwhelming hymn to the risen Jesus. Again, Christianity serves as this powerful force that informs the symbolic world and social structures of the secular stories that are told in opera. And we can go a step further. Even when operas appeal to the occult world that would have been so offensive to a lot of Christian sensibilities, they do so in a deeply Christian way. For example, consider Ulrica, the witch in Verdi's Un ballo in maschera, who summons the devil from hell himself in order to divine the future. And what is it that Ulrica sees? Everything bodes evil and culminates in disaster. Adultery, insatiable jealousy, vengeance, the death of friendship, assassination. Or perhaps we can look at Carmen, who embodies a strange seductress of Proverbs that destroys men's lives and ultimately ends in calamity, in death, in Sheol. Carmen even engages in tarot reading along with a fellow Gypsy or Roma women. And the point is, everything ultimately ends in ruin. Don Jose is ruined. He abandons a virtuous woman in Micaela. He abandons his own mother, the obedience and honor that he owes her, and she dies desperate and alone without having seen him, while he destroys himself and ultimately ends up killing Carmen, ruining his own life and the lives of many around him. He is the embodied cautionary tale of Proverbs. So the demonic world in opera truly remains demonic and anti-Christian. Given that, in some sense, he is the ultimate opera composer, the greatest face of opera, I've already cited works by Giuseppe Verdi. And it's critical to note here that Verdi himself, according to all known reliable accounts, was agnostic. He was not personally a devout Christian by any means, but nevertheless, his work is consumed with Christian themes and Christian ideas. Not only does his big breakthrough in Italy come with Nabucco, which is based on a story on the Catholic Deuterocanon of the Bible, but even some of his other later operas like Don Carlo and La Forza del Destino are steeped in Christian themes. La Forza del Destino really only makes sense in a Christian society based on honor culture, where chastity is prized deeply as a virtue, where honor to parents and obedience to one's father is due, where elopement is really a sin against the family, where blood guilt exists objectively, where there is still that sense of the blood avenger of Deuteronomy chasing down blood unfairly spilt in the family, in Romeo and Juliet-esque style. And where Don Carlo's arc of repentance brings him to deep humility and loss until he finally sheds his sin before the grace of God. Verdi's operas are also simultaneously quite critical of the church. Don Carlo and La Forza del Destino both have negative representations of what the church can be. In La Forza, Fra Melitone is a heartless hypocrite who does not care for the average people, who does not care for the pauper. And in Don Carlo, the church exercises power even over the state and is deeply corrupt in its institutional expression, at least as highlighted in the opera. But nevertheless, Charles V, who in a chiastic structure opens and ends the opera mysteriously in its four-act structure, presents an alternative perspective of profound piety. A man who has abandoned the throne, who has perhaps either died and come back as a ghost in the narrative of the story, or hidden away in a convent and now lives for the heavenly life. The plot leaves it ambiguous and is veiled in this mystery that draws the listener in. And Charles V, this emblematic Roman emperor, concludes that there is ultimately only peace in the heavenly realm. He embodies an escapist religious attitude that's quite different than any other religious viewpoint presented in the opera. And there are several. Which brings us to our next point. A lot of these themes increasingly feel distant from modern audiences in the West, and even more so from the directors and producers that envision and stage these operas for modern audiences. In fact, I think it would be fair to say that often directors project their own anti-Christian biases into their productions, assuming that Christian themes will not resonate with audience members that are actually more willing to receive them, whether they themselves are religious or not, than the directors staging the productions. And so, aspects of Don Carlo, for example, that are deeply steeped in Christian piety, like the appearance of Charles V as the semi-resolution of the plot at the end, or the sound of a heavenly voice at the end of Act 3, which laments the injustice with which people are treated by the corrupt state and the corrupt church hierarchy that enables and even controls the state. These are all points of embarrassment, rather than some of the emotional and philosophical high points of the works. And I must stress again, the composer of these works was himself not a Christian, but he could appreciate and was steeped into the Christian culture that made these works intelligible, that had developed the melodic and harmonic language and the symbolic world in which these stories, these theatrical masterpieces, made sense. Now, if this were all there were to say about classical, operatic, and symphonic music, then you could very fairly make the point, well, we've just simply never yet explored what fully secular classical and operatic music might be like. But in truth, in the aftermath of World War I, and especially World War II, classical music did take a turn towards the postmodern, towards the post-God world, towards the world that Nietzsche would say is a world in which Europeans had killed God and had begun to philosophize a way of life without him. And what we see is that honestly, classical music takes a categorical turn for the worse. It alienates itself from its own self, from its own past soul, and from the audiences that used to support it. Perhaps the only point of comparison is some forms of visual art, but no other art form that I know of so fully abandons its own harmonic language, the desire for dissonance resolving into consonance, the idea of there being some sort of objective sense of order that this music has emerged out of and embodies. A lot of classical music now turns to arbitrariness, or to mathematical precision that is not attuned to the human ear. Music becomes serialist. Stravinsky is a great early transitional example, who originally writes more tonal classical music, but then plants a new flag with The Rite of Spring, based on an explicit return to pagan themes. And as thrilling as its rhythms are, it has to a large extent abandoned traditional tonal harmony. And if the trajectory had ended there, Stravinsky's piece could have been a very interesting experiment that was perhaps a little bit grating to a traditional sensibility, but could nevertheless still be comprehensible, to a large extent because of its strong rhythmic patterns. But with the development of intensive serialism and other forms of explicitly iconoclastic classical music, most audiences were lost. And as far as opera is concerned, have there been any monumental operatic composers since Puccini died at the beginning of the 20th century? Not only, but consider at the same time the simultaneous decline in singing quality. Any great opera lover who has listened to the great old singers, who has had the tolerance to listen to the wax records before the electrical records, and then the electrical records, and then the acetate records, and then finally into the beautiful era of better quality mono and ultimately gorgeous wide stereo image recordings in the 50s and 60s. Anyone who has come to know this recording tradition and to love it will honestly say that there's been a sharp decline in the number of great singers, to the point where today we're hard-pressed to name anyone who sings at the level of Maria Callas, Elena Nicolai, Mario Del Monaco, Franco Corelli, Beniamino Gigli, Tita Ruffo, Enrico Caruso, and many of the other operatic names that dominated the world of classical music until the early 1970s or so. And that decline has also been gradual. In the 60s, you could hear people already complaining that opera was not quite what it had been before. And in the early 20th century, the same was said. Now, to some extent, people always look back to the past with fond nostalgia that is a little bit unrealistic, with rose-colored glasses on. And funnily enough, since we're talking about biblical themes, the Bible itself critiques this behavior. But that doesn't mean that there is no pattern here. That doesn't mean that there is no downward sloping trajectory. Opera is perhaps the poster child art form about which people can agree is dying. And art is the expression of the soul of a people. Art is what a civilization does when it has excess resources and time and is not simply worrying about bare-bones survival. And so what comes across in the art is what's really in people's hearts and minds and souls, so to speak. And with the change of the Western soul, with the vast transformation in religious and philosophical beliefs, with the abandonment of traditional morality and piety, it is no wonder that art has changed so substantially. Now, immediately, an extremely valid and logical counter-argument would be, okay, you might be saying all of this about opera and classical music, but have other art forms not developed? Have other art forms not grown and maintained much of that tradition? And the truth is, they have. Jazz music is actually probably the most logical development of the increasing harmonic and instrumental complexity that we see in classical music, although it has needed to simplify and abandon a lot of the aspects of the grandeur of opera and classical stage concert music in order to adapt and survive. But it has developed the harmonic language and the rhythmic language, and has truly created something new that still stands as beautiful in its own right. And then there's musical theater. Musical theater is perhaps the clearest descendant of opera, and it resonates with audiences to a large extent precisely because it maintains some of the tropes that made opera work. Powerful vocal singing, dramatic, powerful theatrical, well-staged storytelling, catchy melodies, beautiful orchestrations. Although again, we have to note that as with jazz, a lot of the grandeur and the scope of opera and the complexity of its musical expression has been simplified. And then of course, movie scores are the liveliest place for classical concert-esque music, although there are two distinct genres. But the best-known classical-esque music composers today tend to be movie composers. And then finally, we can look to popular music, which of course is based on traditional Western harmony and some traditional Western rhythms that have emerged from the mixture of classical music and then African beats and jazz and so on. But even now, let's step back and consider, are we not seeing a deterioration in even some of these art forms? How much of popular music today, as an expression of the overflow of the soul of our society, is deeply vulgar and disrespectful? I mean, just imagine paraphrasing some of the lyrics of a lot of number one hits. with a straight face, in conversation, without the rhyme and the rhythm and the beats, people would think you're insane. People would think you're perverted, and often with good reason. So as much as other genres and artistic expressions have maintained the Western cultural musical heritage, they've also suffered from some of that death of soul, and things are not necessarily looking better. I would highly recommend Rick Beato's analyses of how pop chart toppers today are often a far cry from what they used to be. It is entirely possible for a society to live on the fumes of its ancestors. It's entirely possible that you could live on your grandparents' money. That doesn't mean that you're contributing to the wealth in building and creating something new. You could be expending it until there's none left. And I think that in some areas of Western music, that is certainly the case. Now, finally, insert AI into the mix. AI has basically taken us full circle. All the technological developments of the last century that made the traditional, bare-bones, unamplified concert stage increasingly foreign or maybe out of date, out of sensibilities of the new modern world, which was committed to technological progression, of overcoming the limitations of the past, of evolving past the old aspects of human nature and human limitations. All of that is now climaxed, and you no longer even need the human element to create music. The more digital music has become, the less human it needs to be until there's no new active live human aspect to it at all. And so, in this sweeping dramatic irony, classical music has the potential to once again be an ultimate art form. It is the clearest place where music can be fully acoustic, entirely performed by people, unamplified, voices trained to their athletic Olympic potential, and the art being at its most human, soul to soul, in a concert hall, the most intimate connection between performers and audience. But the question is the Western world ready and willing to receive this? Is it able to have a renaissance in classical music? Is it able to understand works from the past that feel increasingly foreign and embarrassing? Is it able to match the grandeur of those works with new compositions? Can opera survive? Can opera revive without a revival of traditional godly piety? I leave these as open questions for all of us to reflect on, and I'd like to leave you with one final test case. One of Puccini's great underrated masterworks, the one-act opera Suor Angelica, the middle of the three one-act operas that make up his triptych, Il Trittico. And it tells of a princess who has a child out of wedlock, so her family sends her to a convent and separates her from the child, and nobody visits her for many years, until finally her aunt comes to see her. And she, Angelica, expects an update about her child, about how the rest of the family is doing. She's eager to know. And her aunt is stone cold and simply asks Angelica to sign away her birthright, her claim on any familial possessions, so that her sister, who is now getting married, can be married in peace and there be no issues with the inheritance in the family. When pressed, the aunt is forced to deliver the news that Angelica's child has died, and then she leaves as Angelica desperately signs the contract, now having no son to worry about disinheriting. In her profound grief, she ends up poisoning herself, until suddenly she comes to her senses, and as a Catholic nun realizes that she's committed mortal sin. And so in one of the most dramatic, beautifully orchestrated, powerful moments in all opera, Puccini has one mother pray to another, Angelica to the Virgin Mary, mother to mother, begging the Mother of God to intercede for her, and for her to find grace with the Lord of the universe, to be forgiven of her sin, so that she might not die in damnable guilt. Now, if you've read any program or basically any modern staging that I've been able to find of this opera, directors feel compelled to paint Angelica as a deeply mentally unstable woman, sometimes even placing her in a psychiatric hospital. And the opera ends with her having this strange vision of her son perhaps appearing to her, and then she dies in a state of ecstatic, deeply misguided peace. But that is not what Puccini wrote at all. We can tell with confidence both from the libretto and from the harmonic language that he uses that to Puccini, this is one of a handful of rare operatic happy endings. What happens in the original is that the Blessed Virgin herself appears to Angelica, bringing her little boy with her, and she dies in peace, being accepted in heaven, while her fellow nuns sing their nightly prayers. Suor Angelica is a close parallel story to Madame Butterfly, but the critical distinctive element is that Angelica truly knows God and experiences His grace. And so what would otherwise be a hopeless tragedy turns into a story of divine mercy and peace, of reunion and redemption and forgiveness that was not possible in the earthly plane, but God will nevertheless make happen because He is a God of mercy and justice. It is an opera that is the ultimate expression of Italian Catholic piety at its finest. It is one of Puccini's own favorite works. And it is a grave injustice against the operatic tradition when directors assume that audiences are simply too enlightened to appreciate a story like this, that they have to naturalize it, that they have to make it make sense for some sort of nihilistic sensibility, and ultimately ruin the integrity of what Puccini has composed. Art is the expression of the soul of a civilization, and if a civilization wants to have no soul, then I'm afraid to say there is not much hope for its art.